Nationalism shifted the concept of sovereignty in the early 19th century. Sovereignty is the authority to make final decisions. For most of human history, sovereignty rested with a dynasty, a royal family. Sovereignty passed from one generation to another within a royal family. Families fought over sovereignty. At the beginning of the 19th century, a new way of looking at authority emerged: nationalism. National sovereignty, popular sovereignty, comes from the bottom up instead of from the top down. In dynastic sovereignty, God anoints a royal family. And then that family treats the state as if its own personal property. With nationalism, the authority to rule comes from the consent of the governed. It rises from the bottom up. So in the early 19th century, nationalism disrupted both internal and external politics, domestic policy as well as foreign policy. At the root, it caused a shift in loyalty. Who should a community follow? In dynastic politics, loyalty goes to the family. And it doesn't matter the ethnic background of the family, the religious background of the family, because all that matters is that the family has sovereignty. So, for example, in the early 18th century, the Stuart dynasty died out. There were no more Protestants in England able to ascend to the throne. And so the English Parliament turned to the Hanoverian dynasty. They were ethnically German, but they were the closest male heirs to the throne who were Protestant. The loyalty was to the family. In the early 19th century, this began to change with a new concept of loyalty. That loyalty was rested on a group of people who share a common culture, share a common heritage. So that it would make no sense to have a German king sit on an English throne. But yet, that's how most of human history worked. Romans created an empire. And so there were Romans governing over Egyptians, Romans governing over Greeks. The idea of aligning political power with ethnicity is a modern idea. It happens out of first a spontaneous struggle against an external force, right? This independence movement. That's one source of the rise of nationalism. There's another source where it's a manufactured identity to overcome internal divisions, a quest for unity. The spontaneous struggle is much harder to maintain, much harder to get people to motivate against that external enemy at the beginning of the 19th century. In the mid-19th century, it was much easier to manufacture an internal identity that creates unity. Nationalism. The French Revolution and its wars illustrate both of these features of how nationalism developed as a spontaneous struggle against an external force, and then the attempt to manufacture an identity to create unity internally. The 1791 Constitution placed limitations on the Bourbon monarchs. At first, the Bourbon monarchs went along. But then Louis XVI decided that he was going to challenge that. He wasn't going to go along. He ran away. He tried to join foreign armies, armies from the Habsburgs in Austria, armies from the Hohenzollerns in Prussia, papal armies coming in. He tried to join those armies in a war of restoration. And when he did, it created a popular backlash. And the king himself was accused of treason. Now, in a dynastic state, that doesn't make any sense, because in a dynastic state, the king is loyal to himself. How could he betray himself? But he was accused of betraying the nation, the people of France. He himself should have been loyal to the people, not the people loyal to him. This is the revolutionary idea that comes out of France. And that war continues. In 1799, Napoleon engineers a coup, goes on a war of expansion, eventually trying to create his own empire, but doing it in the name of liberation. That the French armies were going to liberate local peoples from their old dynastic chains. And so they spread this idea of nationalism across Europe. You can see this in the Marseillaise. The technical term is, the official name is the war song of the Army of the Rhine, right? Arise, children of the fatherland. The day of glory has arrived. Against us, tyranny's bloody standard is raised. Against us, tyranny's bloody standard is raised. Do you hear in the countryside the roar of those ferocious soldiers? They're coming right into your arms to cut the throats of your sons and women. Children of the fatherland. These people share a brotherhood, fraternity. It is that fraternity that is the call to arms. Not loyalty to a king, not loyalty to a god, but to their brothers, their fraternity. Against the tyranny's bloody standard is raised. Against us, tyranny's bloody standard is raised. The Prussian tyrant, the Habsburg tyrant, the papal tyrant, they govern for themselves, not for the good of the people, not for the public good. They are coming to restore a monarch. The refrain of this says it over again, right? To armed citizens, form your battalions, march, let an impure blood water our furrows. Let the blood of tyrants fertilize our fields. Citizens, equal as brothers in arms, against an unjust hierarchy. The Marseillaise. If you get a chance, use the magic Google and listen to the words. You'll listen in French. You can also see an English translation there for yourself. Well, why does this become so popular? Well, first, it was written and then sung in 1799, famously by volunteers from Marseille. These volunteers from Marseille, the south of France, were in Paris. And when they hear about approaching Austrian and Prussian troops, this becomes their rally cry. This becomes their motivation, right? They're not fighting for Paris. They're not fighting for king. They're fighting for France. This mattered because in 1793, the French National Assembly instituted a levy en masse. They wanted to raise an army of 300,000 men. Well, how do you get 300,000 people to volunteer? And if you can't get them to volunteer, how do you convince them that conscription is a good thing? Well, you tell them that you're not fighting for God and King. You're fighting because all of these tyrants are coming down upon you and they're going to put you into slavery. So this levy en masse was a way to generate national loyalty so that the people of Marseille would fight alongside the people of Paris, and the people of Paris would fight alongside the people of Nantes. Because that type of internal loyalty did not exist in a dynastic state. It needs to exist inside of a nation state. In 1795, the French National Assembly realized the significance of this and created a national anthem. A national anthem. A rallying song for all of the people to show them that as citizens, they have a say in government. That the government rested upon their consent. National sovereignty. Now, between 1789 and 1799, they were in a life and death struggle, particularly along these two borders here, right? The Rhine border with the Holy Roman Emperor on one side, and then the southern border against Habsburg and papal armies in the Alps. And if you look at the map between 1789 and 1799, they were able to hold their own. But the French armies went on the offensive after 1789, and the map dramatically changed. Napoleon took over control of the Republic. He eventually creates an empire. His armies are able to then defeat almost all of Europe on the battlefield. And in the process, he usurps dynastic control. He overthrew dynasties across Europe. For example, Napoleon drove out the Habsburgs from northern Italy, and Napoleon created then a kingdom of Italy. Consolidating previous small dynastic holdings into a larger holding that he called Italy. That reimagining of political boundaries stuck with the people of Italy. 1806, Napoleon toppled the Holy Roman Empire, redrawing the political boundaries, consolidating small states, and created the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806. Once again, that Napoleonic usurpation, throwing old dynasties off, stuck with the popular imagination that there was no reason to stick with the old ways. Another example of this is the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. During the 18th century, the Prussians, the Russians, and the Austrians, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, and Romanovs, had wiped Poland off the map. When Napoleonic armies rolled into Eastern Europe, they defeated dynastic armies and redrew and recreated a Duchy of Warsaw. Once again, this ignites in the popular imagination that the people of Poland don't need to be under a Prussian king. They don't need to be under an Austrian king. They don't need to be under a Russian king. So these Napoleonic armies, right, in their war for liberation, showed that it was possible to change the political boundaries and who actually was sovereign, created a desire for independence. If the French could rise up and overthrow their dynasty, why couldn't the Germans do it? Why couldn't the Italians do it? Why couldn't the Poles do it? So French Revolutionary and Napoleonic armies showed the value of nationalism in resisting foreign aggression and providing national unity that creates a stronger state. All of that looked for naught with the Congress of Vienna, because the Hohenzollern armies, the Habsburg armies, the Papal armies, the Romanov armies, the Hanoverian armies, right? The Grand Coalition came together and defeated Napoleon, knocked him off the throne, and the Congress of Vienna tried to restore dynastic states. That was successful in putting kings back on the throne. It was not successful in driving nationalism away. The continued persistence of nationalism is easily seen in Germany. The idea of nationalism started to develop in late 18th century Germany with the work of Gottfried von Herder. Herder himself was a romanticist, right? Romanticism rejects the Enlightenment. Instead of looking at the intellectual or rational view of the world, the Enlightenment emphasizes the emotion. That shift moves from looking at the world as creating universal cultures, as if the Greeks or the Romans were the ideal universal culture, and then everyone should be Greek-like, everybody should be Roman-like. Instead, Herder started looking at the uniqueness of each culture, things like honor, courage, bravery. And so the Romantics looked towards the Middle Ages rather than the Greco-Roman period. And in the Middle Ages, there were Frankish kingdoms, there were Visigoth kingdoms, there were Germanic kingdoms, the Anglos and the Saxons. So each of the various countries in Europe started looking to their national development or national origins in the Middle Ages. For Herder, this specifically meant to look at folk music versus classical music. Right? Classical music, or the things like Beethoven, Bach, Handel, this was chamber music. This was music meant for the court or aristocratic circles. Herder then started looking at folk music, the music that's played in taverns or on street corners. He believed that this was the source of national vitality, of the vitality that sprung from the people from the bottom up. Now, he was definitely in the minority trying to do this in the late 18th century. But the opportunity came with the next generation in particular the Grimm brothers or the Brothers Grimm. They blamed the petty dynastic squabbles on the Napoleonic victory, for the Napoleonic victories, right? That the Germanic princes and kings were squabbling with each other, and those divisions prevented the Germans from coming together against the French. The Grimm brothers wanted what the French had, or what they believed the French had, a national spirit, a national motivation. And so they started looking at folk tales, not the folk music, but the stories that were told in taverns, the stories that parents told their children. And so they went around the Germanic states and collected those stories. They wanted to show to the German people that they shared a common culture. In the process, right, they were showing that the values sprung from the common people, right? Values don't come from God to king to church to people. Values come and rise from the people themselves, the stories that people tell their children. And what they were able to show is that names may change, place names may change, certain descriptions may change from one telling of the story altogether, but that it didn't matter whether a person was in Hamburg or Munich, didn't matter what names they had in the stories. The stories all had a shared set of values. And so they collected these stories, wrote it down, placed it in a book, and in the process, they created a German language. This period, late 18th, early 19th century, is a period of dictionaries, standardizing grammar, standardizing handwriting. This process of standardization is just as important as the standardization of weapons. The creation of a national culture. That national culture brought people together across regional lines and allowed them to fight shoulder by shoulder against a common enemy. Dynasties resisted this in the early 19th century. Dynasties saw nationalism as a way for people to topple governments. In the late 19th century, a select group of European monarchs realized the power of nationalism. If they could identify their own dynastic interests with the interest of the community and get the community behind the dynasty, that they could then increase their own political power. The states that were able to mobilize national sentiment and mobilize industrial production, those states became the most powerful and successful and dynamic states in the late 19th century.